making sure everything is great. Hi, Naomi.
Criminal, public international, banking,
So what did you
Israel. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about his background. I'm sure you'll find it as interesting as I do. You'll know where all this experience and knowledge is coming from. Stephen Limper was born in Montreal and received his BA in philosophy from McGill University and his MBA from Columbia University in international business. Stephen has had a dual career, one in international business, and two, that is with 2 factories in the Caribbean. And number 2, working for 40 years as an activist and volunteer for Israel with the Canadian Jewish community, and above all, the congregation Hashomayim. Stephen shared many activities in the Hashomayim, and I won't go through them all because it's very extensive. I will mention a few very special ones. He shared 2 Shaar bond dinners, and perhaps most gratifying of all was the privilege to chair the gala celebration for 60 years of Rabbi Emeritus Dr. Wilfred Shushat rabbinical leadership at the Shaar. Stephen was honored by the Hashomayim as a Katan Breshit in 1980, and more recently as a Katan Torah. Stephen has been deeply committed to the state of Israel. He's currently a deputy chairman of the International Board of Governors of Hebrew University. In the past, he has served as president of the Montreal chapter and national president of the Canadian Jewish Friends of Hebrew University. To strengthen ties with Israel, Stephen served on the Canada and Quebec Israeli committees for over 30 years, including many years as an officer, treasurer, and vice chairman.
10 years.
Thank you very much.
I picked them up every morning to go to
I'm
school.
told there are 2 microphones, and I should go from one to the other if one isn't loud enough. Is this one working well?
Yes.
No, but you hear me well, or you want me to use the other one? Everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I'd like to begin by thanking Sydney for that beautiful introduction. I hope Irene was listening to every word. I'd like to begin with a true story that took place quite a few years ago. I'll give you the setting. We were at a luncheon. There were 3,000 people in the room. The guy who was chairman and was going to introduce a very famous guest speaker by the name of Abba Eben was so excited that when he got up, he just fumbled and he didn't know where to begin, but he began by saying, "Before I speak, I need to say a few words." I always like that. So I'm going to use that. Before I speak, I'd like to say a few words. First of all, I'd like to thank Naomi Cassie. She has been working at this job tirelessly for many years, and what it makes us Shaar Hashomayim as strong and as active as it is are its volunteers. So thank you, Naomi. And her support. Fantastic people, Esther and Sid. Just listen to that introduction. He's a wonderful guy. So thank you, all 3 of you, for the work you do, and thank you all for coming out here today. I do appreciate this audience. I was wondering if we would get a minyan, but we seem to have passed it. We have a sensitive topic. a controversial topic. In fact, a friend of mine sent me an email. Sorry I can't be with you, but I'm enjoying St. Agath. But what in the world are you doing walking into this minefield, Liver? And someone else in the room will appreciate that we had dinner together, and someone was challenging me on the speech, and when he finished his soliloquy, I said to him, but I haven't given the speech yet. How do you know what I'm going to say? But it shows you that people feel strongly on this issue. And so I want to offer you full disclosure. 2 important points. I'm dealing with a controversial subject. My bias, and I'm going to give you my personal bias, is against the Chief Rabbinate. I'm a strong supporter of the separation of religion and state. That is my bias. So, certain things, I'm going to try and not make it personal. I'm going to try and clarify for you, and then maybe we can together decide how we should react based on the facts. So, that's one part of my disclosure. My second disclosure, so no one misinterprets my criticisms that relate to the Chief Rabbinate, is that I love Israel. And you have to see and hear everything that I'm saying in that context. I truly believe that Israel is the greatest national liberation movement of the 20th century, and we, all of us in this room, all the Jews living today, are fortunate to be living in the renewed state of Israel, and we can say that we have the privilege of walking in the streets of Jerusalem. So please, whatever I say about the rabbinate, understand that it is in that context. So I'm going to cover the 3 controversies of our current day. They all came together just in June. The first was the wall, but it was followed on the very next day by conversion, and then a few days later by what is now known as the infamous blacklist. A lot of people are angry. A lot of people are not quite sure how to react or overreact. And that is what we'll discuss today. We'll try and understand exactly what happened and what might be an appropriate reaction. So first of all, let us briefly talk about the rabbinate. The rabbinate did not start with the foundation of Israel. It goes back to the Turks and the Europeans, and it was an historical position. But I want to go to Herzl for one moment, because Herzl sounded a warning. He said Israel should never be a theocracy. And when one day the state is born, make sure that the priests remain within the temple. By that he means that the rabbis should remain outside of politics and within the confines of religion. Things have changed. Who's to blame? Is it Ben Gurion? Is it Bibi Netanyahu? Is it both? Well, in the first instance, I would say it was Ben Gurion, because Ben Gurion made the deal with the religious parties. He made the deal to create the official rabbinate. He created what is known as the status quo. He gave the rabbis the rights to control issues of personal status, marriage, divorce, kashrut, yeshivas, and so forth. In 1953, that 1947 agreement was extended to religious councils who carried out and had the jurisdictions of courts carrying out many of those same privileges with respect to personal status. From the point of view of Jewish law, and I'm delighted to have my brother-in-law here today, Rabbi Elkins, so he can certainly correct me. But from the point of Jewish law, from everything that I could find, there is no requirement for either a chief rabbinate or a chief rabbi. What we have is a situation now with our chief rabbinate that too much power has been centralized within a certain group. And we know the old adage from our experience that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we have that situation with our chief rabbis today. But I don't want to throw them all into the same boat, and some of the names will recur. If we go back, we've had some very great chief rabbis. We've had Rav Kook, Rav Uziel, Rabbi Gordon, Chief Rabbi Avadia Yosef, who was controversial but was a great halakhic scholar. And so we have a history of some wonderful chief rabbis. But there was an important shift. In the early days, the chief rabbis were Zionists. They were passionate about bringing the Jewish people together. They wanted to bring as many people as possible into the fold. Their goal was inclusion, not exclusion. My hero of the bunch is Rabbi Uziel, and I'll have some more to say about him later when we talk about conversion. The way the chief rabbinate is structured is we have two chief rabbis, which in itself suggests a problem. Why does this small religion need two chief rabbis? Can't we get along enough with one? No, so we have a Sephardi chief rabbi and an Ashkenazi chief rabbi. And currently the two chief rabbis are the result of nepotism. So we have Chief Rabbi Lau, who's the son of former Chief Rabbi Lau, and we have Sephardi Chief Rabbi Yitzhak Yosef, who is the son of former Chief Rabbi Yosef. I'm not disparaging the quality of these two men, I'm just saying. But one wonders how often the truly great scholars, the truly great halachas, would put themselves up for the rough and tumble of these elections with all the dirty politics that are involved. I have an idea that the greatest would tend to stay in the background and out of the fray. How much does power corrupt, and how corrupt is the chief rabbinate? Very corrupt. We currently have two chief rabbis who've been convicted. The first that I'll mention is Rabbi Yonah Metzger, the Ashkenazi chief rabbi, for bribery and corruption and influence peddling and the whole range of deeds, who took, that they know of, 10 million shekels, $2.5 million US, and he's currently serving a 3.5-year prison sentence. Lest we don't have complete balance between Ashkenazim and Sephardi, his co-frere at the time, Chief Rabbi Eliyahu Bashki Doron, who served from 1993 to 03. By the way, Metzger was during a similar period. I think he was 03 to 2013. But Doron has not yet been sentenced, but he's been convicted. His scheme was known as the rabbi scam. what was the rabbi scam? The rabbi scam involved going around and giving rabbinical titles to civil servants, primarily police and security people, which enhanced their salaries by $500 to $1,000 per month. It cost the government hundreds of millions of shekels for this scam. How much was the kickback to him? I don't know. But that is what happens when you have this kind of power situation where there's money involved, where there's incentive. I've always said, long before the current situation, I have a blog and I send out emails, and I've always made the point that historically, nothing to do with Israel, that religion and politics make terrible bedfellows. They really don't work, because what happens is, when you get religion involved in politics, it makes the politics worse. But even more importantly, when you get those two involved together, the politics makes the religion worse. And so the spiritual direction, the spiritual encouragement, the spiritual leadership that we're looking for from our rabbis is diluted by this kind of situation. And so many people would like to see the Chief Rabbinate go. All of this is only by way of introduction. Sydney, that reminds me, we once had a speaker at Shaar and we all met after Shabbat. We were sitting in the Kensington Hall, and we were all at the tables, and when we were speaking there, the speaker said, "How long do I have?" And the chairman, I can't remember who it was, but the story is true, he said, "We leave at 1:30, but you can speak as long as you like." So, we have a bit too much information up here. You stop me when you want to answer questions or tell me there's only so many minutes left, and I'll bring it to a conclusion. But let's go to what happened just now in June 25th. Some people regard it as a massive betrayal by Bibi Netanyahu and the current government. Was it a massive betrayal? Well, you can judge. There's no question that an agreement was broken. Now let's understand what the agreement was, because people are confused. So as you know, there's the Women of the Wall. They wanted to conduct women's services with the Torah. When they did that, in the main part of the wall, even in the women's sections, they would be attacked, even physically. And so a compromise was worked out that they would go to Robinson's Arch. That has been working. And you enter Robinson's Arch from Dung Gate. You don't come to it from the main plaza. And so the Reform, the Conservatives, the Egalitarian, the women feel cut off. They feel like second-class citizens. And so a very lengthy, complex negotiation with Sharansky, with the Orthodox, with the Reform, with all the movements took place over a lengthy period of time, and they finally agreed that the egalitarian, non-Orthodox stream, they would integrate the Kotel with Robinson's Arch, so there would be a continuum. In other words, you wouldn't have to go to Dung Gate, even though that was a closer access. You would come in as part of the Kotel and be part of the Jewish family. It was an agreement that everybody signed on to. And then what happened a few weeks ago? The Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox party, gave an ultimatum to Netanyahu and say, that has to go or we're going. So there's 2 points of view with respect to Bibi. You remember we started and said, who's to blame, Ben-Gurion or Netanyahu? Some people say Netanyahu really shouldn't be to blame, because when you started with pleasing the diaspora Jewish community versus some strongly felt views in the Israeli cabinet by the ultra-Orthodox member, you knew ahead of time who was going to win. And the die was cast, and ultra-Orthodox, in the end, gave an ultimatum to Bibi. Either you get rid of this deal on the law, or we're out. So Netanyahu did what any good politician would do, he capitulated. Now, how serious is this? I would say it's more serious psychologically. It's more serious in terms of the blow it struck to people who are not Orthodox, who care about Israel, but feel somehow disenfranchised now. Why that distinction? Because women and so forth and egalitarian services can still take place at Robinson's Arch. You can say that nothing has changed. It's just remained the same. But what has changed is that a deal that was made to integrate Robinson's Arch with the Kotel has been canceled, and a lot of people are very upset. I had a copy of a letter that Charles Bronfman wrote to Bibi Netanyahu, speaking on behalf of a certain constituency, saying how upset he was and begging Bibi to do something about it. But we'll come back to that in another context. So we had a noble compromise, it was broken, but the wall isn't the end of the world. It's there. Everybody can still go to it. It's just that a deal was broken, and the symbolism. The wall was meant to be a symbol for the Jewish people. Many people have raised the question, should the wall be a synagogue? Is the wall a synagogue? And a lot of people say no. Rabbi Fishman from our Montreal community takes that position. In fact, he makes a very interesting point. I read a recent article by Rabbi Fishman, he's a rabbi in Dollard, who said, just look at us. We are a laughingstock. You know what's going on in UNESCO, you know what's going on with the Arab countries. They're challenging the very idea that we Jews have any connection at all to the Temple Mount. And he said, well, we're fighting over who can come to the wall and who's allowed to come and where they can come. They're laughing at us and telling us it doesn't even belong to us. This is an Arab territory. This is their third holiest site. And UNESCO has ruled completely disconnecting Jewish history from its reality. So, you know, it's a painful thing. We had the Minister of Health. His name is Yaakov Litzner. Now, he's not just anybody. He's a minister in Bibi's government from the United Torah Party. He's Minister of Health. And he made a statement that he is delighted with this development because Reform Jews do not have a place in the wall and will never have a place in the wall. Now, the reaction to that has come from the diaspora, but there's been very little reaction from the Orthodox world on that issue, modern or ultra. And it's something we'll come back to. There is so much more to say on the wall. Rabbi Daniel Hardman and his co-professor, Yossi Klein Halevi, have written extensively on this and beautifully. In fact, I've read their articles, but no time to go into them, and they're very, very worthwhile. I would like to move on to what I consider the most serious and important and dangerous and compelling of the three issues, and that is the issue of conversion. Now, this, dear friends, is a very serious issue. And on the same day that bill was introduced nullifying the agreement with respect to Robinson's Arch. A bill was introduced that nullified the new arrangement with respect to conversion. Now, the whole issue of conversion is a 2-hour talk. It's so complicated, there's so many historical factors. I'm going to try and briefly tell you what this is about, how it affects us, how it doesn't affect us, and then we'll get to the blacklist because it's connected. So the conversion issue is tied up to the whole question of who is a Jew. And you have to understand that there are two who is a Jew questions. One is for the purposes of Aliyah, and we tend to go to the Nuremberg definition, and basically what Israel wanted to do was anybody who was killed by Hitler, anybody who was Jewish enough to be killed by Hitler should be able to get into Israel. And we don't have a problem today with that aspect, even with our rabbis, and we'll go into that further. The problem is, who has the right to speak to the Chief Rabbinate? And that's a whole other cup of tea, and that's something that has changed over time and has varied and is very much of a political football and very much filled with human tragedy, real tragedies of broken homes and people who have been betrayed and marriages. By the way, I don't know how many people were here when Rabbi Seth Farber came to speak at Shaar. If you ever get a chance to hear him, you must hear him. He heads up an organization called ITIM, I-T-I-M. And Rabbi Farber was the person who challenged the Chief Rabbinate because people were being blacklisted. They didn't know why. Oh, that makes me interject at this point. I have to talk about Ivanka Trump. Ivanka Trump, as you know, was converted by a very well-known Orthodox rabbi in New York, Rabbi Lukstein. Rabbi Lukstein was blacklisted. Essentially, they would not accept his conversions. However, after the US election, the day after Mr. Trump was elected, a very funny thing happened. They met and they decided that Rabbi Lukstein's conversions were valid and that Ivanka Trump was Jewish. We, as I said earlier, we earlier on had Zionist chief rabbis. They were very orthodox. They were very strict. But their heart was there for the unity of the Jewish people. And that's what distinguishes the Zionist rabbis from the non-Zionist rabbis. For the Zionist rabbis, the return to Israel and the coming together of the Jewish people is the key point. And that was the case with the earlier rabbis. In other words, they bent over backwards to be inclusive. Our current chief rabbinate is bending over backwards to be exclusive. Now, there's so many aspects to this. There's the whole Sharon affair. And without going into what happened when he pulled out of Gaza, basically he had to change his coalition. He had to kick out the national Zionist, very religious rabbis and take in the ultra-Orthodox rabbis. Why? Because he pulled those families out of Gaza. The nationalist Zionist rabbis were furious, and so Sharon went the other way. That cemented the power of the elders in Israel. They're moving in that bill back to only the chief rabbinate can do conversions, nobody else. The Nieman Commission had all these groups together, and they reached an agreement. And what was the agreement? That Orthodox, conservative, Reform, they would all educate and prepare prospective conversion candidates. They would prepare them, and then their final conversion would go before the Chief Rabbinate. The deal was made, and then was broken by the Haredi parties. They would have nothing to do with it. All they wanted was total control. And that was a disaster. Then there's a case of Rabbi Druckmann. Rabbi Druckmann was a very religious man, and he was head of the conversion process, but he was a Zionist rabbi. Wouldn't look any different to you. He has a great big bushy beard and is just as religious as anyone else, but he was a Zionist rabbi. So when all this fell apart with the Zionist rabbis, Druckmann was eliminated. He was thrown out. But the worst part of it is, all his conversions from 1999 backwards were nullified. So you can imagine what that did to families and people who were living as Jews, and suddenly their position was nullified. Now, I've got to move on, so I want to finish, but I want to come back. And I've got to leave you with the idea that there were some wonderful, wonderful chief rabbis. And, you know, you might think of the book of Ruth, one of the most famous chapters in literature, where the convert Ruth tells her mother-in-law Naomi, whither thou goest, I shall go, thy people will be my people, I'll be buried, and so on. Everybody knows the lines. The most beautiful, compassionate, and of course, uplifting prose in favor of the convert. But you can take either a generous, open heart point of view, or you can take a narrow point of view. So I want to go back to one of the early chief rabbis. He served in Palestine 1939 to 1948, and in Israel from 48 to 54. His name was Ben Zion Meir Hai Uziel. And 2 days before he died, he said, I have kept in the forefront of my thoughts the following aims: to disseminate Torah among students, to love the Torah and its precepts, Israel and its sanctity. I have emphasized love for every man and woman of Israel. That's a key line. And for the Jewish people as a whole, Ahavat Yisrael, love for the Lord of God of Israel, the bringing of peace between every man and woman of Israel, in body, in spirit, in speech, and in deed, in thought and in meditation, in intent and in act, at home and in the street, in village and in town, to bring genuine peace into the home of the Jew, into the whole assembly of Israel, and all its classes and divisions, and between Israel and its Father in heaven. Uziel is my hero. I mean, this guy is fantastic. He loved the Jewish people. He loved Zion. He wanted everyone to be included. Rabbi Riskin comments on Uziel. He said, Uziel should be our standard. That's what we need today. We need Rabbi Uziel, because Rabbi Uziel, as Rabbi Riskin say, if you have Jewish seeds, Rabbi Uziel felt, if you're living in Israel, and you're fighting in Israel, and you're supporting Israel, you're almost Jewish. It behooves us, from every halachic Jewish point of view, to make you Jewish, so that you don't end up with two Jewish peoples. And so this whole issue goes on, but I want you to know there were some very good guys. So let me quickly end on the part of that maybe upset Shaar the most, and that was the blacklist. It upset Shaar because both our rabbis are on the blacklist, Rabbi Shushan and Rabbi Shaar. All right, how big a deal is it? And what does it mean? First of all, let's understand what it means. In my view, it's connected to conversion, but it's not the big deal that conversion is. What it's saying, in effect, is more of an insult than anything else. Because what this says is, Rabbi Shushan or Rabbi Shaar tells the Chief Rabbinate that Stephen Lippert is coming to Israel and that he's Jewish. They will say, I don't recognize what you have to say. Their answer is, in defense, they're saying your documents are improper, your papers haven't been properly completed, all nonsense. And they've chosen 160 rabbis, including the 2 from Hashomayim. And of course, it's not that serious a problem, and you have to understand why. Because first of all, it has nothing to do with making Aliyah. That's the ministry, and the ministry will accept Aliyah from anyone converted by any of the streams, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform. They are accepted for Aliyah. The strange thing is that same conversion in Israel will not accept you for Aliyah. So there's a double standard that favors Jews from outside of Israel. So it very much affects Jews Israel. Why are the American Jews so furious then if it doesn't really affect them directly in that way? They're furious because they feel all this is just the beginning of the iceberg and it's going to spread and so forth. So the blacklist is a serious insult, which led to a letter, which if you told me 5 years ago that I'd ever see a letter like this from President Hashomayim, I would have said, impossible. So our president, who's a wonderful president, was very upset, as the whole congregation was, and wrote a letter in defense of the rabbis to the consul general. Some of you have gotten it, those who haven't, I'm not going to read the whole letter. I'll just read the key 3 points that the president of Hashomayim demands on behalf of the congregation. Number 1, congregation Hashomayim calls upon Chief Rabbi Lau to issue an apology to Rabbi Shaar and the other 150 rabbis on the list for publicly discrediting their rabbinic standing. 2, we call upon the Chief Rabbinate of Israel to formally apologize to Congregation Hashomayim for its actions that impact our members and our spiritual leadership. And 3, we call upon Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to take the necessary steps to ensure that diaspora Jewry no longer encounters systemic rejection from the Chief Rabbi. That's quite something for a synagogue like Hashomayim to write, but you understand the conditions. So this blacklist is more, though, an insult than a reality. So it means that if Rabbi Shaar wants to stay, like Bear Lazarus is now going from our congregation to Israel, and his daughter just left, and he wrote me a letter when all this happened saying, you know, I'm worried, what if my daughter wants to get married, and Rabbi Shaar says she's Jewish, and we're observant members of the congregation, they'll say we don't believe it. Yeah, it's an issue, but you know, I'm sure we can find someone else who will back it up. Nonetheless, it's a terrible insult. It's an insult. And it's an insult by people whose moral standing is questionable. So how do we react to all this? In conclusion, what should we do? Where do we go with it? Some people say we should take certain actions. Some people even say we won't fly LL, or we're going to cut back on our donations, or we're not going to buy Israeli wine. Every person is entitled to their own position. I personally am very opposed to that answer. My answer is, let's get more involved. And let's try, as we can, to influence as much as possible, always recognizing that we are in Canada, not in Israel, that those who are there fighting on the front line, it's a wonderful democracy, and they have the right to decide. And always remember that Israel has a proportional representation system of voting. so that tiny parties have an undue influence. Thank God Justin Trudeau, after wanting to change that system to something like PR, decided he better not touch it. It might be the most democratic system in the world, but it tends to give little groups terrible power when they come in and can make up the coalition. So my answer is we have to do more, not less, and we have to fight for Israel to make it better, to make it stronger, and that will make us stronger too. Thank you very much.
Did we not get a mouthful, a brainful, a roomful of information just now? So interesting, so helpful. We all still have questions in our mind, and we all have confusion, but at least we have a very inspirational, hopeful outlook from the speech that Stephen just made. I'm really privileged and very honored to thank you, Stephen, for this beautiful, beautiful speech. And I thank all the members of our committee, as well as Rita, who worked so diligently at the door. And I thank everybody here for coming and supporting this program. On behalf of the Shaar and the Sundays at the Shaar program, I'd like to offer you this token of our appreciation. Next month, we'll be honored to hear Dr. Joe Schwartz, and we will be speaking in September. Watch your emails, your Shaar email, and the Suburban and the Jewish News for information on that one. Thank you, everyone.